Welcome to the next part of the video where we're going to be reassembling our entire gearbox from scratch. So right now in front of me I have the two halves of the gearbox. I'm for now just going to be working on the half that does not have the switch running through it. So I can set that aside. Right now to start off with, I want to make sure that the height adjustment screw is backed out still, that I can easily get my motor in when I need to. So for a first step, I'm going to be focusing on getting in the latch that holds the spring guide. To do this, it has a spring, and you can see on the latch itself, it has a little shelf here. Now to adjust it into the correct position, I'll place it like so, just to see that everything is aligned correctly. You'll see that on this, it makes an S shape, and this is handy for you to remember which way that it goes in. So this is the correct shape. If the S is facing backwards, it's incorrect. So I'll put the spring in, aligning it like such so that one end is pushing against the shelf and the other end is pushing against the shelf of the gearbox itself. Sliding that up and over. Our pin, we can even hold the pin down and check it for function, and it's working just fine. Next, we can reassemble the piston assembly. So to do that, we'll start off with the piston head, attaching it to the cylinder. Now to keep things nice and pretty, I look for the NOVRITSCH logo so that it's aligned into this window on the gearbox, and I'll place the piston head, cylinder head into the cylinder like such, making sure that this opening on the bottom is facing 90 degrees perpendicular downwards towards the NOVRITSCH logo. Next, I can attach my nozzle. Then I can place the tappet plate into the small groove on the nozzle itself. So to make this handy, I push the nozzle all the way back lightly, it doesn't need much force, and then slide the tappet plate up and over it. To check for function, when I push the tappet plate forward, the nozzle should move backwards and forwards like it would during function. Now my spring fell off, but all I have to do here is just make sure that the circle is facing upwards, and then I hook it up and over this hook on the bottom of the tappet plate. Next, we can put our piston back in, making sure that the rack is facing downwards towards the bottom end of the tappet plate. Next, I'm going to focus back again onto my gearbox. So I'm going to get all these gears back inside. Again, paying very close attention to make sure none of the shims from disassembly to assembly have moved or been removed from these. If you do remove them to clean the gears, just make sure that you place the same back into the correct position. Otherwise, the gear alignment shouldn't be exactly as it is. So I can check those are nice and smooth. Next, I'll put in my sector gear, again checking my shims. That's nicely aligned. When putting the sector gear in, it's super handy for reassembly to make sure that the smooth section is actually facing upwards to where the piston rack would be. This makes assembly a little bit easier to align the tappet plate with this delayer. Next, I'm going to wait before I'm putting this bevel gear in, because first I'm going to get in the motor once more. To get the motor in, we'll place the motor inside, making sure that the positive end is into the window of the left-hand side of the gearbox housing. Once I've placed that there, I'll notice that I need to still place in the spring into the top front end of the gearbox and motor, and I'll depress it and push it down until it catches inside of this section of the gearbox. At this point, I'm going to tighten the screw just to make sure nothing moves out of the way. Again, grabbing a plain flathead screwdriver and tightening that slightly. As soon as I feel resistance, I'm going to stop. There we go. Now that the motor is in, I can pop the bevel gear into position. which I most likely will have to fiddle around a little bit later to get the delayer in. This will be the last step before this reassembly. Next, I want to get this entire piston assembly back into place. So when I'm placing this inside, I'm looking for a few things, few spots of alignment. One of the first spots of alignment is these round holes. Hold firmly on the inside of the gearbox. So those are aligned. Next, I will pull the piston back out and make sure that these two grooves on either side, left and right, of the piston is inside this track on the inside of the gearbox. This will ensure that everything else is nicely aligned. Now I can see there I've got a little bit of resistance, and it's because while reassembly happened, I can see that this gear had moved a little bit. It's now preventing me from getting that piston rack up and past it. All I need to do is remove the bevel gear, reposition that gear so that the flat end is facing upwards, and then I'll pop this back inside. Again, looking for alignment, and now our piston is inside the track. Perfect. Next, again, this spring can be popped back in there, and it's handy to actually grab a little hex key to lift the end of the spring up and over that post. And now the spring of the tappet plate is firmly in position. Next for this reassembly is left just this little anti-reverse latch. So the anti-reverse latch has a spring attached to it which sometimes moves. To position it correctly, we're putting the spring in and then rotating it till the hook catches the back end, so the curved end of this anti-reverse latch. At this point again, I'm going to remove the bevel gear, pop the anti-reverse latch in position so that the spring on it is pushing it, the flat face, up towards the motor. I can pull this back and keep it there with a small screwdriver. This can be quite tricky and requires a bit of a steady hand. Once that's in position, then I'm going to drop back into place my bevel gear, and before I release this, I'm going to push down on the top of that pin, making sure that it doesn't jump back up and out of place. Now at this point, I can bring back the other half of my gearbox, and I can put into position the switch and pop the two switch screws back into place. Now at this point I've released my finger from that anti-reverse latch, but it seems to be staying in place. If it jumped back out, you might just need to restart that, or put the switch in first and then move to the anti-reverse latch. Once those two are tightened, not overly tightened, but just finger tight, then everything should be in place for us to put the two gearbox halves back together again. So to do this, we'll lift up and over carefully, and then looking from above, we want to make sure that that anti-reverse latch pin, as well as all of the pins on our gears, are aligned with the holes of the bearings and in the gearbox shell itself. And we'll push firmly down to align everything. Now at this point, my anti-reverse latch is aligned, but my gears are not. So I can place my fingers in the bottom end, in the open end where I can feel the gears, slowly and carefully pushing on the gears till everything aligns, and then it all snaps back together. To ensure alignment of everything, I look at the gearbox from above, and this seam is nice and flush. And from the bottom, same thing, the seam is nice and flush. Now we reattach all of the screws holding the two halves together, so I can place them into their spots all around the gearbox. Now none of these screws need to be overly tightened. They just need to be finger tight, ensuring that they can't back themselves out. But you should really not crank down too hard on them. So let's start. Now at this point of the reassembly, we want to get this guide rod for the charging handle back into the side of the gearbox. So I'll grab the correct Allen key or hex key. So to reassemble this spring guide of the charging handle back into the gearbox, we'll look at this little flat section that's been cut out of it, making sure it's facing upwards. Place it in position, and then we can tighten down this little clamp, holding it in position firmly. Now at this point we're ready to put the spring back inside. So first I'm going to get this retention clip out of the way just by popping my finger inside and getting that button out. Holding it in that position, I can put the spring back inside, and then I can reinstall the spring guide, pushing this button up, pushing the spring guide in until I hear a click. And then that's all in position again. At this point we can reattach our spade clips to the motor. So starting first with negative. Negative is the one on the bottom. And we'll pop that spade clip up and over the terminal, making sure that it's actually clicked and seated into position. We can then turn it around and do the same thing to the positive. So we'll slide it up until we hear a little click. And then, if you have spare of these little zip ties, it will become very handy to actually place through the inside of the gearbox here your zip tie, cinch down in position all the cables like so. And at this point we have a fully reconstructed gearbox.